Jackie, the authorities here are saying that there are at least 445 bodies in that mass grave. And the fear is that there are going to be more mass graves uncovered as the Ukrainian authorities get through all the towns and villages that have been occupied by the Russians and that have now been retaken by Ukrainian forces in the last 10 days. You know, I think that this is finally beginning to put a little bit of pressure on President Putin. He today met the Turkish leader, President Erdogan. This is on the side of the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. Now, Erdogan is one of the very few people who talks to both Zelensky and Putin, talks to both sides, Ukraine and Russia. And Putin said afterwards, well, you know, President Erdogan sort of says that maybe I should talk to President Zelensky, but President Zelensky doesn't really want to talk to me. And then he went on to say, well, our goals have remained the same and we're not, you know, we're not in any rush. So on the face of it, there's no change. But he was also under pressure from the Indian Prime Minister Modi. And I think that now, as the Ukrainians make more and more gains and more of these horrors come up, President Putin is finding himself in a difficult situation. Our story coming up now about the mass grave in Izyum contains images which viewers find distressing from the very start. The grave gives up its dead, and those who killed the men, women and children buried in the forest outside Izyum will eventually be judged. Some of the people whose bodies are being exhumed were killed in shelling, but others appear to have met an even more terrible fate.
Є дані про деяких осіб, які загинули внаслідок ракетних ударів Збройними силами Російської Федерації, внаслідок артилерійських ударів. Є ж також факти поховання цивільних осіб, які були закатовані, вбиті військовими Російської Федерації. От зараз ми ексгумували першу могилу, виявили труп, на шиї даного трупу є мотузка, є тілесне ушкодження на кінцівках даного трупу. Це все свідчить про катування.
Exhumation, DNA analysis and investigation will take many weeks. But the local grave diggers, still working under Russian occupation, did leave some clues.
Інші люди, які приймали участь в захороненні, вели журнал такий. Вони позначали під кожним номером дані. В деяких випадках даних не було, і тому не вказував ні звісний мужчина, ні звісна жінка. І хто саме тут похоронений, незважаючи на ті записи, які містяться в цьому журналі, є предметом слідства і буде встановлено в ході досудового розслідування.
And there are eyewitnesses, people who survived rocket attacks or airstrikes that killed their neighbors.
Тут похована одна сім'я. Ми цього сусіда витащили з своїм сусідом. Ця сім'я його 7 чоловік тут, скоріше за все.
Some dead soldiers still lie where they fell, as Ukrainian troops retrieve the tanks the Russians abandoned while retreating. After the horrors inflicted by the Russians on the people of Bucha and other towns near Kyiv, no one is surprised to hear reports of mistreatment and torture in Izyum, not to mention the threat of Russia using nuclear weapons.
Боятися чогось там, що може зробити ця держава, і тому піти з ними на ту чи іншу згоду, це гірше. Це гірший результат, на який можна піти. Це тоді точно початок Третьої світової війни, тому що це надає право таким державам, як Росія, або державам, які про це думають, або лідерам тих нещасних народів, які обрали собі лідерів таких авторитарних, що спроможні використовувати таку зброю і захоплювати території, чи не використовуючи ядерну зброю, а погрожуючи такою зброєю захоплювати території, катувати людей.
President Zelensky channels the mood of most Ukrainians. Mass graves further harden public opinion. And anyway, with recent victories, they think they're going to win this war.
Lindsay Hilson reporting. Well, earlier I spoke to Nigel Pavo, a British prosecutor who is part of an international team investigating alleged war crimes in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian MP, Maria Metsentseva, who represents Kharkiv city centre in Parliament. I began by asking her what authorities are seeing now in Izyum.
So something we've been witnessing in the town of Bucha in the Kiev region is now being repeated in Kharkiv region. And we're just talking about, it's, you know, not just numbers. We're seeing a plate, a made up wooden cross with just a date of birth, date of death, and a name, no, without even a surname. So this is a challenge number one, identifying the bodies, searching for relatives, DNA tests, and of course the working specialists on the ground. Numerous war crimes have to be investigated.
It is critical, though, isn't it, to establish the facts about how those people came to die. And that will be a process that will take some time.
Absolutely, absolutely, Jackie. But we should not forget that all this is a cause of one paramount crime, which is a crime of aggression. That's why we highly salute the support of UK, US, the number of European states, today's decision of European Parliament on establishing this tribunal. And we are sure the impunity doesn't have to take place. Putin and his top leadership have to be responsible, but also ordinary soldiers who were executing these war crimes. Terrible, terrible stories are about to come. But, you know, we can't look at this news without tears.
Nigel Pavo asks, you have just returned from Izyum. That issue of evidence is critical. What did you find there?
Well, I was the first international prosecutor on the ground there, so it was extremely early. There was a heavy military presence restricting movements, and demining was taking place, I believe, too. So I wasn't actually down there when the mass grave was discovered. I obviously saw the devastation that Izyum has suffered over the previous months in its infrastructure and the damage.
There are disturbing reports
80%.
emerging just this afternoon that people have been found with ropes around their necks and hands tied. Do you have any confirmation of this?
I don't, but if it's true, obviously it's the clearest evidence of torture and executions.
Is it possible that some of these people died from shelling? There was some suggestion that some may have died from the lack of healthcare. All of this does need to be established, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I've heard similar reports, and it all needs to be determined precisely into a criminal standard of proof, exactly how people died. It may be that amongst the civilians there's also Ukrainian soldiers buried there. But like you say, it will take a bit of time. But once it's gone through meticulously and the facts are proved, I'm fairly certain that there will still be evidence of mass war crimes here.
And you have been travelling around Ukraine a lot. What is the pattern that you are seeing in terms of how the Russians have been operating?
Well, there's strong patterns forming now. Obviously, there's patterns in occupied areas, like in the Kiev region in March, and now in Kharkiv region. And there's also patterns, actually, the missile attacks on civilian centres. And the patterns are key, actually, to building big war crimes cases. Because where you see patterns and it's clear they're not happening randomly, it tends to indicate that higher up the chain of command, this is an intended feature or intended consequence.
Maria, what do you think happens next? I mean, obviously, we've talked a lot about how, you know, evidence needs to be gathered, things need to be proven. But what happens next as far as you're concerned?
This is enormous amount of cases to be registered. As I can compare it, while comparing it to Bucha, sorry for doing so, but we've just been there yesterday with an African delegation, our colleague from Iceland. There are bodies which are still, since March and April, not identified. You can imagine that there are the remainings of the bodies, and this is very, very particular process of exhumation, which is now currently happening in the town of Izyum. This is very important for us that no evidence is lost, and it brings the whole story together. And I would like to add, we are seeing a signature of the brutality of Russian soldiers, but they are acting differently in Izyum. There were no bodies on the streets, like in Bucha, for instance, on the Apple Street, as it's called. They're trying to be more, they're trying to hide more evidences, but there is still a lot.
The Ukrainians have already started trying to prosecute Russians themselves for alleged war crimes. One of the first was against a 21-year-old army sergeant. Do you have any concerns about that, that actually you're looking to prosecute easy prey, if you like, young men who may not have had any choice? And actually, the much more difficult process is prosecuting those at the very top.
Jackie, there is a choice, and we are witnessing some calls from Russian soldiers addressing Ukrainian side on the hotline, willing to put the guns down and to be, let's say, as of a title, war prisoner for the time being, to be on the list for exchange.
And Nigel Pavo asked that very question about the prosecution of very young soldiers, for example. How do you pursue prosecution once and if you gather the evidence against those at the very top, against Putin himself?
Well, it's a collection of crime bases. So whilst you see these soldiers committing crimes as direct perpetrators, all sorts of different crimes actually around Ukraine, above them is a local commander who's overseen this. And above them is a regional commander who's also overseen it. And when you put the crime bases together and look at the patterns and analyze them, like I said, it's often the case that you can see a pattern that couldn't have happened by chance, either because regional commanders or higher have ordered it, or because they simply allowed it to happen on their watch, on their knowledge. And that it suited them as a tool of war to subjugate and terrorize the civilian population.
Can I ask what the Ukrainian authorities, the government, intend to do about people who in some way supported or cooperated with the Russians in any way? Do you intend to prosecute them?
This is a very simple understanding in the criminal code of Ukrainian state. It's a betrayal of your state. When you do cooperate with someone who invaded or has an intention to kill or killed your citizens, who occupied your land, this is all very clear in the legal terms. So yes, we have to be very tough with those who did cooperate with Russians, or with Russian authorities and occupiers.
Maria Mezenzeva and Nigel Pavo, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.